Everything started on that dark summer night when I first tasted the true meaning of fear. I'm a 15-year-old boy living in Fardis. Every summer, we spend our holidays at my grandmother's old villa, deep in the heart of a dense forest. The house is surrounded on three sides by towering trees, and in front, a narrow road leads to a foggy swamp. Beyond the swamp lies a flat land and a rushing river, its sound adding an eerie ambience to the quiet nights in the forest. It was the summer of 2022, and like always, we had gone to stay there. One night, my friends and I decided to sneak into the forest around the house to explore. We planned to go on Tuesday night, but that same day, my family was invited to a wedding. This was the perfect opportunity for me to stay behind and explore without any worries. My family left around 8 p.m., and I was alone until 10 p.m. when my friends were supposed to arrive. As the sky grew darker, a heavy silence fell over the house. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but something felt off. I kept hearing rustling leaves and faint whispers outside, making my heart race. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the frantic clucking and squawking of my grandmother's chickens. I was terrified, thinking maybe a wild animal or a thief had broken into the yard. I grabbed the only thing I could find, a rusty saw, and with trembling hands, I took a flashlight and headed outside. I shone the light towards the chicken coop, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Standing there among the chickens was a tall man with glowing red eyes and sharp horns, dressed in a black suit. His feet were hooves, and he was staring directly at me. I screamed in terror and bolted towards the door, feeling like he was chasing me. Just as I reached the door and flung it open, I saw my friends approaching the house. Gasping for breath, I quickly told them what had happened, but they didn't take me seriously and said I must have imagined it. Determined to prove them wrong, we all headed back to the chicken coop, but the creature was gone. To take our minds off the fear, we decided to go for a walk in the forest. The air was colder now, and a thick fog had settled among the trees. The sound of crickets and the wind rustling through the branches made the atmosphere even more unsettling. As we walked, we suddenly saw the same creature again, standing among the trees, staring right at us. This time, we were all frozen in fear, unable to move. My friends started reciting verses from the Quran loudly, and strangely, the creature began to fade away. We decided to head back home immediately, but our bad luck wasn't over. A pack of wild wolves emerged from the forest and charged towards us. In a panic, we all scattered. I managed to climb up a tree, but one of my friends, who was heavier, couldn't get up. We were terrified, thinking the wolves would attack him, but to our surprise, they simply passed by him as if they were running from something themselves. It dawned on us that even the animals of the forest were terrified of that creature. We struggled to make our way to the river, where we found an old fisherman sitting by the water. We stayed with him for about an hour, trying to regain some sense of safety. When I saw my family returning, my friends and I ran back to the house. That night, we couldn't sleep from the fear, and even now, when I think about it, my body trembles and my heart races. That forest was never the same for us again, and the mystery of that creature remains hidden in the darkness of those forest nights.
When the night was dark and silent, the forest surrounding my grandmother's house held its breath. Everything was calm and cold. I'm a 15-year-old boy, and we live in Fardis. Whenever the holidays come, we go to my grandmother's villa, nestled deep in the forest. Her house is surrounded by trees on all sides. In front of the house, a narrow road leads to a swamp, and beyond that, there's a flat piece of land, followed by a river. This story begins in the summer of 2022. As usual, we spent our summer at my grandmother's house. One night, my friends and I decided to sneak into the forest surrounding the house to explore and see if we could find anything interesting. We planned to go on a Tuesday night, but it coincided with a wedding that we were all invited to. This was the perfect chance for me to stay behind and thoroughly search the forest. After much pleading, my family agreed to leave me alone at home while they went to the wedding. They left at 8 p.m., and my friends were supposed to come at 10 p.m., so I had to stay alone for 2 hours. As I sat on the couch, slowly drifting to sleep, suddenly, all of my grandmother's chickens and roosters started screaming. I was terrified, thinking maybe a thief had broken in. I had nothing to defend myself with, except for a saw lying nearby. Grabbing the saw and a flashlight, I made my way to the chicken coop. What I saw there still haunts me to this day. A man with red eyes and several horns, dressed in a black suit, was standing inside the coop. I froze in fear. With trembling hands, I pointed the flashlight at him and realized he had hooves instead of feet. I immediately turned and ran towards the door to escape. Just as I opened the door, I saw my friends approaching the house. I told them what had happened, but they didn't take me seriously. I wanted to show them the creature, but it had vanished. To avoid being left alone, I reluctantly agreed to go into the forest with them. As we walked deeper into the woods, we saw the same demonic figure from my grandmother's house standing right in front of us. We were paralyzed with fear, unable to move. Desperately, we started reciting every verse from the Quran we knew out loud. The creature began to retreat, but we wanted to head back to the house. Unfortunately, our luck got even worse when a pack of wild wolves, apparently fleeing from some dogs, came running towards us. In a panic, I managed to climb a tree, but one of my friends, who was a bit heavier, couldn't make it up. We were all terrified, thinking the wolves would devour him, but they ran right past him. That's when we realized the wolves weren't running from the dogs, they were running from the demon. We had no idea what to do next, so we ran towards the river and found a fisherman there. We stayed with him for about an hour until I saw my family returning from the wedding. My friends and I rushed back to them, and we all went home. Even now, when I think about that night, chills run down my spine.
I hope this message finds you well. My name is Masume, 27 years old, from Courage. I'm married with 2 children. We've been renting this house for about 7 months now. About 10 days ago, our water heater stopped working. The pilot light just wouldn't stay on. When my husband got home from work, I asked him to fix it. He removed the cover of the water heater to make it easier to relight the pilot. That's when he noticed something, a filthy, grimy plastic bag tucked beneath the water heater. I hadn't seen it, but he did. "What's this bag doing here?" he muttered, pulling it out and handing it to me. He then turned back to the heater, focused on fixing it. The plastic was disgustingly dirty, yet, for some reason, I felt compelled to open it, even though I usually have a strong aversion to touching anything unclean. It was like something had taken control of me. The plastic was stuck together, warped from the heat of the water heater. With trembling hands, I pried it open. Inside was a tiny, ancient-looking bottle. A small piece of brown paper was crammed inside, surrounded by what looked like dried herbs. The bottle was sealed with a cork, jammed in so tight it couldn't be easily opened. At that moment, a wave of dread washed over me. My husband glanced at the bottle in my hands, and his face went pale. "Oh my God, that's some kind of black magic," he exclaimed. Panic surged through me, and I quickly threw the bottle into the trash. We took out the garbage and dumped it into the bin outside, hoping to rid ourselves of whatever curse it might carry. But from the moment I touched that bottle, our lives turned upside down. I can't even begin to describe the horrors that have haunted us since then. Just thinking about it makes me sick to my stomach. Desperate, I went to see a spiritual healer. They told me it was an incredibly powerful curse, one that had been hidden there for nearly 3 years. It was placed by a previous tenant, intended to drive her husband mad, so she could divorce him. Dear friends, I beg you never touch anything strange or out of place, especially things that give you a bad feeling. The healer said, if I had used a cloth or gloves, the curse wouldn't have attached itself to me. The haunting of the long-haired girl. This story is from many years ago, and the sheer terror of it has blurred the details in my memory. I only remember fragments, but I told my mother about it at the time, and she witnessed it all. I was in the 2nd grade, around mid-school year, when my grandfather passed away. We travelled to Gillen for the burial. As the men carried the body to the grave, I caught a glimpse of the corpse. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. After the burial, I turned to my mother and said, "Mom, I saw a girl with long hair, her head bowed down." We returned to our city, and soon after, strange things began to happen. I became completely sleepless. Every night, I would wake up with wide, bulging eyes, screaming and crying that a girl was staring at me. I could describe her in chilling detail. This would go on 4 hours until I would eventually calm down in my mother's arms, but only slightly. I even remember one night when my grandmother was so desperate, she began reciting Quranic verses in my ear. But I, with a voice that wasn't entirely my own, said, "Don't recite, she's reciting too." Even now, it sends shivers down my spine to think about how terrifying and incomprehensible this was for an 8-year-old. For 2 months, I was trapped in this nightmare. I stopped going to school, falling into a deep depression. Then, one day, the horror reached a new level. The haunting happened again. And this time my grandmother forced me into the bathroom. My screams pierced the air, and my mother rushed in to find me sobbing uncontrollably, clutching my back. When they checked, a large bruise had appeared on my spine. I've always believed that jinn and demons can't physically touch us, but that moment made me question everything. That night, my mother was terrified. She wrote out Ayatul Kursi from the Quran and placed it inside my pillowcase. I don't know if she did anything else, but to this day, that verse remains in my pillow, and I recite it every night. Since then, nothing quite as terrifying has happened to me, but the nightmares have never left. They've haunted me for years, leaving me drained and exhausted every day. At least now I can sleep, even if the dreams are relentless. This experience is one of those mysteries that was never solved. I never found out who or what I was seeing.
The Bloody River Incident. My grandmother once shared a terrifying story from when she was younger and not yet married. There was a river near her village where the locals would wash their clothes and dishes. My grandmother would wait until everyone had left, then she would go to bathe in the river. One day, after washing her clothes and preparing to bathe, she noticed that the water was gradually turning red, almost as if it was becoming blood. At that moment, a horrifying noise erupted, and she quickly put on the clothes she had brought with her and hid behind a tree. To her shock, she saw a woman dressed in black with a dark, sinister appearance approaching her. My grandmother panicked and ran, only to find another woman with the same dark features sitting by the river bank. This second woman was washing a bloody heart in her hands. In a state of terror, my grandmother screamed and fled toward her home. As she reached the house and went inside, the sinister woman disappeared. She locked the door and, after some time, her fear subsided. Later, as she was sweeping the house, she heard screams coming from the neighbor's house. She rushed over and found the neighbor's mother screaming and hitting her head. Upon closer inspection, she saw that the neighbor's chest was open, and his heart was missing, with his clothes stained in blood. When the police arrived, my grandmother recounted everything she had seen. The police informed her that the woman was pregnant and that a malevolent spirit, known as Al, had taken the woman's life. They warned my grandmother that if she encountered such a spirit again, her life could be in danger. Fortunately, nothing further happened to her. The mysterious pin. Hello, I'm 18, and I want to share a chilling experience from 4 years ago. I swear on everything that this truly happened. Around 4 years ago, my family and I gathered at my grandmother's house for a spring cleaning. My grandmother's house is about 50 years old. Since my grandmother had recently undergone back surgery and couldn't do heavy tasks, my mother and my aunt took on the job of cleaning the floors, while my other aunts handled the kitchen and dining area. When it was time for lunch, I noticed that a pin was stuck to my mother's pants. I asked her why she had pinned it there, and she replied that she hadn't used a pin and didn't recall doing so. She removed the pin and put it in a drawer. After lunch, I swear that the same pin had reappeared, sticking to my mother's pants again, all by itself. Freaked out, we called a spiritual healer to our grandmother's house. The healer informed us that the house had a spirit. He assured us that the spirit posed no threat unless it was provoked or disturbed. To this day, that incident remains unexplained, and it's one of the many strange experiences we've had in that old house. The fiery shadows. Hello, I'm Fatma, and I want to share some eerie experiences from my childhood. When I was just 11 months old, our house caught fire. The burns I suffered were so severe that doctors advised my parents to take me home to spend my last days there because they didn't think I would recover. Thankfully, a woman named Roxarie, known for her skills in treating burns, helped me. After several months of treatment, I started to recover, but the scars from the burns remained on my hands and legs. The trauma from the burns seemed to affect my nerves and my emotional well-being. While living with my grandparents, my mother and older sister began to sense strange things happening. My sister even claimed to have seen something unusual. When I was around 4 or 5 years old, I would often wake up screaming at night. My mother said that sometimes I would even try to hit my sister in my sleep, seeking comfort. In response, my parents consulted a spiritual healer who identified that someone was bothering me and that there was a problem with my sister as well. The healer gave my mother a protective charm to place on my back at night to prevent disturbances. After my mother placed the charm behind me one night, I screamed for a few minutes, but after that night, I slept more peacefully and was no longer troubled. Even now, I sometimes experience nightmares or sleep paralysis, which causes me to wake up frightened. To feel safer, I sleep with my mother at night to avoid these fears. The shadow of the wedding night. I want to share a story about my grandfather, which is quite chilling and significant to our family history. This experience dates back to when my grandfather was a child. He always felt the presence of someone next to him, which severely impacted his life and made his childhood very difficult. Here's the story in his own words. On the night before my wedding, I needed to go to the mountain to collect wild chamomile, which is a tradition in our culture. It's believed that collecting and using chamomile the night before the wedding ensures a prosperous life for the couple. I gathered a lantern and other supplies, mounted my horse, and set off for the mountain. On the way, I saw several extremely bright, white lights that were out of place, and I heard strange noises coming from them. I knew something was wrong and decided to flee. But before I could, I felt a presence grab me from behind and pull me back. Despite my screams and pleas for help, I was dragged away until I lost consciousness. When I came to, I found myself surrounded by tall shadows that encircled me completely. I was unable to move or escape. One of the shadows approached me and, with a loud voice, said, "You belong to me, and I won't let anyone else have you." It was my doppelganger. I asked, "What do you want from me? Why don't you let me live peacefully?" The doppelganger replied, "Since the day you were born, I have been watching you. I prevented anyone from coming near you because I wanted you for myself. I pushed people away from you and caused trouble in your life to keep you isolated." I was terrified beyond measure, but suddenly, all the shadows and my doppelganger vanished. A few people approached me, and upon seeing my condition, they realized what had happened and offered to help. One of them said, "I can solve your problem for good." They pulled out some strange items from a bag, wrote symbols in an unfamiliar script, and chanted words I didn't understand. Then, they made a mark on my hand with a knife and covered it with a smelly herbal substance. Afterward, they told me that nothing would hinder my life anymore and that I could go in peace. From that night onward, I no longer felt the presence of any shadow beside me. People stopped distancing themselves from me, and my relationships with my family improved. I am grateful that my life changed for the better, and the shadows of the past no longer haunt me. The Angelic Nightmare. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, I used to have a recurring nightmare that haunted me during our time in our old house. It wasn't just any nightmare, it was always the same, and it terrified me deeply. In my dream, I would wake up in the living room of our house, where there were 2 angel statues. I was always scared of these statues because their faces seemed to change in a disturbing way at night. I was the only one who saw this. The nightmare would begin with me waking up in front of one of the angel statues. Paralyzed by fear, I would try to escape to the smaller living room, where I could see my entire family sitting on the sofas. Despite their presence, I would be frozen, unable to move, feeling like I was turning to stone. The horror was so intense that I would wake up screaming and run to my mother's room to sleep. This nightmare plagued me for 2 or 3 years, and my fear grew with each recurrence. However, when I turned 14, my parents decided to move to a new house. On the last night in the old house, I had the nightmare once more. This time, instead of freezing me, the angel statues simply stood up and walked away. Since then, I haven't had that nightmare again. It's strange how such an eerie experience can linger in the mind and how sometimes, just leaving behind a place can bring an end to such haunting dreams. The shadow on the mountain. It might sound strange, but I want to share a chilling experience I had with my friends. One morning, we decided to hike up a mountain to forage for wild mushrooms. As we reached the midpoint of the mountain, something terrifying happened. Suddenly, from the base of the mountain, a massive, black figure began climbing rapidly towards us. It was so large and dark, almost like a giant gorilla, but I couldn't quite describe it. I told my friends to stay quiet and hide behind the bushes, clutching stones for protection. We were all drenched in cold sweat, and my heart raced uncontrollably. In just a few moments, the figure passed us with incredible speed. The path we had taken 40 minutes to climb, it traversed in just 2 minutes. It continued up the mountain, disappearing from view. None of us had ever seen such a creature before, but we had heard stories of a creature called Korzangulu or Golok in the mountains, which only added to our fear. Despite our terror, we decided to continue our hike. As we reached higher ground, I spotted something that looked like a person standing on a rock. It was very dark and seemed almost human but with an eerie presence. I thought it might be a shepherd or someone collecting honey or gum from the mountain. I approached to ask about mushroom locations. But as I got closer, the figure turned towards me, and sheer terror gripped me. I froze and could barely move. In a state of panic, I turned and ran as fast as I could down the mountain, taking the longest strides I could manage. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the base of the mountain and looked behind me, I saw nothing. I hoped maybe I had just imagined it. However, my friends never made it down with me. I tried calling them, but there was no signal. I was too frightened to go back up. Later that afternoon, when they finally returned, one of my friends had fallen from the mountain, and the rest of the group had brought his body down. I have never gone near that mountain again since. This experience has haunted me, and the memory of that shadowy figure still sends chills down my spine. The Cursed House. Hello, I'm Zara. I'm 18 years old, and the story I'm about to share is one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. It all started in the fall of 2020, shortly after my mother gave birth to twins. We were leading a normal, worry-free life until one night when everything changed. The lights in our house started flickering, and the satellite connection failed, causing all the lights in our home to go out. My father went outside to check if anything had happened to the building, but our neighbors said everything was fine on their end. It was strange and unsettling, but we didn't pay much attention to it at the time. In the weeks that followed, my mother's behavior began to change drastically. She started telling me she hated me, wishing I were dead, and arguing with my father, especially in the evenings. Her behavior was completely out of character and continued for 2 or 3 weeks. Both my father and I were baffled and worried about why my normally loving mother had become so hostile. One day, while I was out and my father was at the barber's, I received a frantic call from my mother. She was screaming, "Zara, get home now," and abruptly hung up. Terrified, I raced home. When I arrived, my father was in a state of shock as well, and my mother was crying as she told us what had happened. She had been sitting on the couch when she saw a tall shadow in the room. She initially thought it was just fatigue from the sleepless nights caring for the babies. But when she got up to use the bathroom, a toy of mine fell to the ground, and she saw the shadow clearly. My father and I were stunned, and my father, trying to calm us, suggested that my mother's difficult childbirth might have affected her mental state. He recounted old superstitions to reassure her and help her relax. The night passed, and for about a month, nothing unusual happened. However, my mother's behavior continued to worsen. One night, around 3 a.m. a strange sound woke us up. We saw a glass had shattered right in front of the wall near the balcony. My mother was puzzled, saying it was one of her new glasses and asking why it was in such a place. I was equally baffled and insisted it wasn't me. We dismissed it and went back to sleep. The following night, another glass broke at the same time and in the same spot. It felt like a malevolent force was separating us from reality. We called my father, who was working late, and he told us to stay calm and wait until the next day. We began sharing our experiences with others, but no one took us seriously, and some even mocked us. The story spread, and people thought our family was losing it. My uncle, who was well versed in spiritual matters, was the only one who believed us. He suggested that someone had cursed our home with a very powerful spell. He explained that the power outage was a sign that the entity had entered our home. My uncle arranged for a special prayer to be sent to us from Kermanshah. That night, there were no more incidents, but the atmosphere in the house remained heavy. A few days later, while I was cleaning the heater, something unusual happened. I found a piece of paper wrapped with a strand of hair and a strange string inside the heater. Terrified, I screamed and dropped it, and neither my father nor I dared to touch it. We felt an overwhelming sense of dread. My father took it to Kermanshah, where specialists dealt with it and removed the curse. Since then, our lives have returned to normal, and my mother is back to her old self. This experience has left a lasting impact on us, and we are grateful that things are now as they should be. The Haunting Embrace. Hello, I'm Setaret. I'm 17 years old, and the story I'm about to share with you is both chilling and deeply unsettling. It began a few months ago, right after my final exams. Exhausted, I collapsed into bed at 10 o'clock. As I lay in my room, a strange sensation of someone gently stroking my hair made me shiver. I looked around, but there was no one there. My heart raced with fear, and I told my mother, but she dismissed it as my imagination. Reluctantly, I accepted her explanation and tried to convince myself it was nothing. That night, at midnight, while everyone else was fast asleep, I lay on my side in bed, scrolling through Instagram. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand graze my waist. I tried to ignore it and fell asleep despite the creeping unease. The following night, I was in a half-asleep state when I felt a pair of arms enveloping me. I could barely make out the figure of someone dressed in a white shirt. This presence visited me each night, wrapping me in an unnerving embrace. On the fourth night, I managed to glimpse their face. It was that of an extraordinarily beautiful girl, her eyes hauntingly mesmerizing. The next night, the familiar touch was gone, and I thought perhaps the visitations had ceased. However, a week later, the terror escalated. I felt unseen hands probing every part of my body, touching me inappropriately. The fear was overwhelming. I ran to my mother, but her response was dismissive. She refused to let me sleep with her and scolded me instead. Desperate, I went to my aunt's friend, a spiritual healer. She told me that because I slept without clothes at home, a spirit had become infatuated with me. The revelation sent a chill down my spine. She wrote a protective charm for me, and I felt a temporary relief. But a month later, the horror returned with a vengeance. I felt a presence attempting to engage in sexual acts with me. I was paralyzed with terror, drenched in sweat, unable to move. Then, I blacked out. When I awoke, my body was covered in bruises and wounds. We returned to the spiritual healer. I recounted the harrowing experience of being violated by this entity. Her face turned grim as she scolded me for not taking the situation seriously and provided me with a list of rituals to perform. I followed her instructions to the letter, including cutting my hair as she advised. Since then, I haven't felt the entity's presence. This story is entirely true. Those who have experienced similar sensations will understand the depth of fear I felt. For me, it was not just an encounter, it was a nightmarish ordeal that left a permanent scar on my soul. The haunting after the graveyard visit. Hello, I'm Yasna, 20 years old. This story takes place 3 years ago, when my cousins and I were having a fun time together, making jokes and enjoying ourselves. One day, they came over to my house, and my mom decided to visit my grandmother's grave. We decided to join her. On our way to the cemetery, we passed by the grave of a recently deceased young man. His photo was displayed on the grave, and my cousin remarked on how unattractive he looked. We all laughed and continued our way through the cemetery, joking around. Afterward, we went to a mosque that had been the site of a terrorist attack related to Afghanistan, and we made jokes about it, saying it was haunted. We were frightened but didn't take it too seriously. On our way back home, we noticed a large crowd around a shop near our house. People were talking in hushed tones, and we found out from a woman there that a girl had recently committed suicide by jumping from a height. We were shocked and unsettled by the news and felt an eerie atmosphere as we went home for dinner and went to bed. That night, I had a disturbing dream. I was asleep when my cousin woke me up, terrified. She said she heard someone calling her name, and she thought it was me. I reassured her that I hadn't called her, but she felt the presence of a girl in our house and said it felt very heavy. We both felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if our home was filled with people. We held each other's hands and tried to sleep again, but my cousin kept waking up, saying that while I seemed asleep, my eyes were open. We realized that the spirits from the cemetery, the mosque, and the shop had somehow followed us home and were angry with us. We couldn't sleep at all, and the fear was intense. When the call to prayer at hand began at dawn, the heaviness in the house seemed to lift. We prayed, repented, and cried for forgiveness. For a few days, there was still some residual heaviness, but thankfully, it eventually went away. Although it might seem ordinary to some, that night was incredibly hard and terrifying for us. It remains a vivid and frightening memory. The haunting at Beheshti Sakina. Hello, I'm Nima, a 36-year-old from Karaj. It's been 10 years since my older brother passed away. His death plunged me into deep sorrow, and for a year and a half, I visited his grave every night. My routine was to sit alone in the cemetery, which was over a century old, and after hours of crying and reflecting, I would return home. During these visits, I often heard mysterious sounds in the Beheshti Sakina cemetery. I would see groups of people mourning, only to watch them flee in terror when they noticed me alone by my brother's grave. They would quickly recite prayers and leave in haste. Years later, one of my friend's mother passed away. Late one night, a few friends and I went to her grave to light candles and pay our respects. The night was eerily calm, with no wind to disturb the flames. But within minutes, a gust of wind extinguished the candles. Everyone wanted to leave, but since her grave was near my brother's, I recited a prayer at his grave before we departed. The atmosphere was tense, and the others were visibly shaken. A few nights later, we returned to the cemetery, this time with a couple of friends and the son of the deceased. After parking near the water trough, we noticed two black cars parked haphazardly. We filled a container with water to clean the grave and saw a few chairs and candles set up around a grave. My friends grew uneasy when one of them pulled out a knife and placed it on the grave, claiming he was scared. I insisted it be put away, and we decided to leave. As we were heading out, we saw people in the upper section of the cemetery, women in white shawls and children playing, which seemed odd for such a late hour. As we approached, the chairs around the grave were noticeably rearranged. We found a white car among the parked vehicles, but no one was around. The car had been moved, but we hadn't heard the engine start. My friends hurried to their cars, and I followed, trying to figure out what had happened. When we arrived at my brother's grave, the others were so scared they barely recited their prayers. I noticed they were anxious and wanted to leave quickly. I wanted to stay and investigate further but was urged to leave by my friends. As we drove away, one of my friends, Yuns, implored me not to return to the cemetery. He swore on my brother's memory that I should not go back. I was deeply curious but respected his plea. The next day, the cemetery gates were closed, and I couldn't visit anymore. I often think about that night and what we encountered. Though I never returned, Yuns's intervention stayed with me, and I'm grateful for his guidance. The events of that night remain vivid in my memory, and even though many would doubt my experience, it was real to me and my friends. The Haunting Whispers. At the age of 16, my fascination with the supernatural consumed me. I spent countless hours delving into occult studies. One evening, I came across a book on spirit summoning. Among its many methods, one intrigued me. It was a solo ritual. Driven by curiosity and perhaps a hint of recklessness, I decided to perform it alone. The night was eerily calm when I invoked the spirit of a dearly departed soul, requesting it to make its presence known by moving objects. Almost immediately, I felt a chill as things began to shift around me. Fear gripped me so fiercely that I fled to my mother's room, too terrified to attempt further contact. I did nothing to sever the connection with the spirit. Days went by, and life resumed its normal pace until the death of my grandfather, who lived with us. On the first night following his passing, our home was filled with guests, and my family and I shared a single room. I awoke at 4 a.m. to study for an exam. The stillness of the night was shattered by a haunting noise, an unidentifiable sound that seemed to echo from all directions. It was a mix of human moans, a cat's wail, and a child's cry, creating a nightmarish cacophony. Then, I heard the sound of frantic footsteps, like a horse galloping through the house. The sound grew louder and closer, a terror I can barely describe. I rushed to wake my mother, and my sister was startled awake too. I suggested it might be a burglar, but my mother dismissed it, saying the house was full of guests. I insisted something was terribly wrong. My mother checked the house but found nothing. We huddled together and read the Quran until dawn. As the morning call to prayer began, the sounds abruptly ceased. The haunting continued for several days, until it suddenly stopped and no one heard anything more. My mother later revealed that the noises seemed to come from within the walls, but she had kept it from us to avoid further distress. Normalcy returned, albeit with odd occurrences like a cat appearing at our home with a strange, mocking demeanor. 2 years later, my sister fell seriously ill and was hospitalized in Tehran. We had to stay there, as her condition worsened. My sister's house had 2 floors, she lived on the lower level, and her mother-in-law lived above. When alone, I frequently heard knocks at the door, only to find no one there. I initially thought it was children playing pranks. One day, while my cousin was visiting, we heard a loud crash from the kitchen. We rushed to find the floor covered in glass and stones, but curiously, no glass was actually broken. Then, an odd sneeze came from the room, scaring my cousin, who fled upstairs. I, unfazed, began to clean up the stones with a vacuum. When I returned, the stones had vanished, leaving only a mess that no one believed. The knocking continued, as did unexplained occurrences like the sound of an adhan from a phone I didn't own, and even my brother heard Quran recitations from an empty room. One night, while my family was at a wedding, I was alone at home. My mother was at the hospital with my sister, and only my aunt's husband, my maternal uncle, was upstairs. He asked me to lock the outside gate, promising to call if he needed to get back in. I locked it, and he left without any garbage. After some time, I woke up suddenly, worried I might have missed his call. I checked the gate and found it still locked. I went upstairs to check on my uncle, only to find him sound asleep. Bewildered, I returned to bed. That night, as I was drifting into sleep, I saw a figure, a short, brown-haired entity that seemed disturbingly youthful. It vanished before my eyes. The next morning, I inquired about the trash and was told my uncle hadn't even woken up. I was convinced it was a spirit, possibly benign given its lack of malice. Other family members eventually admitted to seeing and hearing strange things too. After my sister passed away, we returned to our city. Months later, we went back to her house to collect her belongings. The house was locked and dusty, but on the furniture, we found peculiar marks, paw prints of a cat walking on 2 legs. The unsettling presence at my home never left me. I felt as though someone was always beside me, haunting my dreams and eroding my peace. I was advised to finish the incomplete summoning ritual and to seek spiritual purification. I engaged in intense prayers and sought closeness to God. Over time, my life returned to tranquility, and the shadows of the past receded. The Burning Bride. Hi, I'm Dylan, and I'm 18 years old. I'm Kurdish and used to live in Pave. 6 years ago, in our village, there was a girl named Layla who was madly in love with a boy. Layla's love for him was so intense that everyone in the village knew about it. 2 weeks before their wedding, the boy suddenly decided to break off the engagement and declared that he wanted to marry his cousin instead. In our Kurdish culture, there's no such thing as a temporary marriage. Once you're engaged, you're committed until the wedding day. No matter how much their families opposed, the boy wouldn't change his mind. That night, after putting the ring on his cousin's finger, Layla put on her wedding dress and went to the house where they were supposed to live together. She shouted that if the boy didn't come back to her, she would set herself on fire. The villagers, upon hearing this, quickly brought the boy to the house. But the boy, with complete indifference, said it didn't matter to him. He thought Layla was just trying to scare him. But Layla, without any hesitation, poured gasoline over herself and lit a match. As the flames consumed her, she suddenly realized the horror of what she had done and started screaming for help. But her father and brother wouldn't let anyone come to her aid, saying it was better for her to die because she had brought shame to the family. Layla, engulfed in flames, ran around the house, screaming in agony and terror. The sound of her cries echoed through that dark night and stayed with everyone who heard it. Several years have passed since that night, and we moved to another city. But the villagers still say that every year, near the wedding date, in that same house, a girl in a burning wedding dress appears. She dances and cries, and anyone who comes near can see Layla, even after death, still seeking the love that was taken from her. The Shadow in the Desert. A few years ago, I was stationed as an anti-aircraft gunner on BMSA with Macron Island. Our guns were hidden under camo nets and trees in the desert. Our outpost was at an airport that barely saw any flights, a desolate, remote place. Getting food required a 40-minute walk. Back then, ISIS had just emerged and threatened that the 3 islands belonged to the UAE. On top of that, US warships were frequently patrolling the Persian Gulf. Our commanders kept warning us to stay alert at night, saying that enemy commandos or divers might attack. We fortified our position with barbed wire and tree branches, making it impossible for anyone to get through, even our own officers. Our bunker was 10 meters underground, and the only entrance was a narrow path about 10 meters wide. If you screamed, no one would hear you. The only light was a dim, 100-watt yellow bulb, and the whole area was eerily quiet. One night, around 2 a.m., I was on duty under a moonlit sky. Suddenly, I heard a noise from behind the gun, but I was sure it came from behind the barbed wire. I thought it was just an animal. About 10 minutes passed, and as I looked up, I saw a figure standing by the fence. The figure was tall, nearly 2 meters, dressed entirely in black. I thought I was hallucinating, so I lowered my head again but kept an eye on it. Every time I looked down, it took a step forward. I called out, "Who's there?" but it stood still, not moving an inch. I switched off the safety on my rifle, but there was no reaction. I hid behind the water tank, watching it carefully. With every move I made, it took another step forward. I was terrified, alone, and unable to call for backup. There was no one around. We were about 20 meters apart. I tried talking to it, saying, "If it's you, cut it out and identify yourself," but it remained silent. For nearly 10 minutes, it just stood there, not showing its face or hands. Finally, in a moment of panic and frustration, I decided to shoot. I had 3 blanks and 27 live rounds in my magazine. I yelled, "I'm going to shoot, whatever you are," and pulled the trigger. The sound of the blanks caused it to retreat and then run away. It knew I had live rounds left. We had been trained never to abandon our post or chase an intruder because there could be more of them. The next morning, after my shift, I went to the fence and saw footprints in the sand, but they were unclear, neither boot prints nor bare feet. But I was sure I hadn't imagined it. The footprints showed where it had approached and then ran away. I followed them for about 500 meters, where they split into 3 sets. There, I found a spot where rain had eroded the sand under the fence, making it easy for someone to crawl through. I filled it with tree branches and barbed wire. I was an experienced soldier and knew that if I reported this, I'd be in trouble, court-martialed for not capturing the intruder, and our officers would blame me, so I kept quiet, finished my service, and left the island a month later. To this day, I don't know if it was an American commando, a djinn, or something else. I've never been that scared in my life. The Cursed Spring. Hi, I'm Dee. I've had a lot of scary things happen in my life, but today, I want to share one of the most bizarre and terrifying stories that happened to someone close to me. In my mother's village, everyone believes strongly in spirits and jinn, which has led them to create strange rules to protect themselves. According to them, these rules keep them safe from the unknown forces around them. This story dates back to when I was about 3 or 4 years old, but I recently heard it from a family member. They said, back then, we had a beautiful girl named Rana. Despite her father's strictness and many hardships, she managed to find the love of her life and marry him. But on the day of Rana's wedding, something happened that left the entire village in shock and fear. After the ceremony, Rana and her husband went to the main spring of the village, which we call Darva. As Rana sat by the spring to drink water, she was suddenly pushed into the water by an unseen force and died on the spot. No one was near her, everyone was on the other side of the spring. When they prepared Rana's body for burial, they discovered something horrifying. Her entire body was burned, and there were red handprints all over her skin. The family, terrified, told the village's spiritual healer, who confirmed that this was the work of the spirits and jinn around the spring. Now, that spring is one of the most cursed places in the village. No one dares to go there at night or even close to sunset. Just thinking about it sends shivers down your spine. Thank you for taking the time to read my story. I hope that the fear I felt has been passed on to you as well. The haunting that changed my life. I'm 16 years old, and I want to share a terrifying experience that happened to me and my sister. This story dates back to about 10 years ago when I was a fearless and bold child. My bravery was so intense that it often worried my mom because I would do things that could easily put my life in danger. Just like every other week, we went to my grandmother's house, an old-style home with a small living room that led to the kitchen by a series of stairs, a bedroom, a living room, and a combined bathroom. There was also a narrow hallway that led to the basement yard, where an old wardrobe and a coat rack stood. As usual, my cousin and I were playing hide and seek. I remember that whenever something bad was about to happen, I would get a terrible feeling in my stomach, like an ominous warning. But I didn't take it seriously that day. When my cousin started counting, I quickly ran and hid in the hallway, between the coat rack and the wardrobe. The lights were off, making it even creepier. The wardrobe was large and old, tightly fitted against the wall, with just a small gap in between. The coat rack was covered with old clothes and headscarves, with bags and boots scattered below it. I was small enough to squeeze behind the bags and boots, making me almost invisible. As I crouched there, waiting, I suddenly felt a cold hand brush against my back. Because I was squatting, my shirt had ridden up a bit, exposing my skin. That hand was cold, rough, and felt dead. At first, I thought I was imagining things, so I stayed still, but a wave of dread washed over me. I quickly stood up, pulled my shirt down, but I could still feel the icy touch lingering on my skin. My cousin came running toward me, shouting, got you." But I was too shaken to react. I told her what happened, but she was just a kid like me and didn't take it seriously. When I told my mom, she didn't think much of it either. But from that day on, I was never the same. I became terrified of sleeping alone, crying until someone would stay with me. I couldn't be alone in the house, and the dark became my worst enemy. Years passed, and my sister's condition worsened. She would wake up screaming, hearing voices, and whenever she was alone, she felt something was there with her. One day, when we were out, she called me, furious, accusing me of sneaking into her room while she slept. But when I told her we weren't home, she fell silent and asked to speak to my mom. Later that night, she explained that her door had been opening and closing on its own, and every time she turned on the lights, they would flicker and go out again. Things got so bad that we decided to visit a spiritual healer. The place was far away, and I wasn't allowed inside. I was terrified but also curious to hear what was happening. My parents were in the room with the healer, who asked my mom to fill a pot with water. He placed a tray over the pot and covered it with a cloth. Then, he asked my dad to place his hand on the pot. After chanting some strange words, the healer lifted the tray, revealing that the clear water had turned muddy. He reached into the pot and pulled out a bag filled with bones, a sparrow's skull, a lock, and other strange items. After that, my sister got much better. She now lives apart from us, and though she still occasionally sees those entities, they no longer torment her. Sometimes, she even hears them talking at night, but when she screams or yells, they go silent. The night I should be listened to Grandma. Hi, I'm Mahan, and I want to share with you one of the scariest experiences of my life. This happened just a month ago, and every time I think about it, chills run down my spine. One night, I was staying at my grandmother's house. My cousin and my uncle's son were also there. As the night fell, my grandmother laid out the bedding, and around midnight, she gave us a strange warning: if you need to use the bathroom at night, don't go to the one in the yard. When we asked why, she just gave us a cold stare and didn't say a word. Our curiosity was stronger than our fear. My cousin and I decided that once Grandma fell asleep, we'd go into the yard and see what was going on. It was 2:30 in the morning, and Grandma was fast asleep. We quietly made our way to the yard. As we were putting on our slippers, we heard the flowers rustle, as if something brushed against them. We shrugged it off, thinking it was just the wind, but as we moved deeper into the garden, I felt like someone was walking past us. I clearly saw a shadow on the wall, cast by the moonlight. The further we went, the worse the feeling got. Suddenly, my cousin whispered that he saw two white things, like eyes, near the tree. We laughed it off, thinking he was seeing things, but then I heard a soft voice right by my ear, saying, "If you want to stay alive, leave now." I told the others, but they thought I was just scared and wanted to chicken out. But before we could react, a knife flew out of the trees and landed at our feet. We were terrified and about to scream when we noticed a tall, dark figure standing on the neighbor's rooftop, staring at us. That was it, we couldn't take it anymore. We turned to run back to the house, but as we did, a figure dressed in long black robes, with red skin and a bald head, appeared in front of us. It stood there for just 2 seconds before vanishing into thin air. We ran as fast as we could back into the house. When we got inside, Grandma was awake, looking at us with a knowing expression. "Didn't I tell you not to go there? It's dangerous, and now you'll have to face the consequences," she said. I thought Grandma was joking, but after that night, we all started having terrifying nightmares, and strange things happened to us. It went on for a few days until everything eventually returned to normal. But every time I think about that night, I feel a cold shiver down my spine. The darkest nightmare of my life. Hi, I'm Amir Hossein, and today I'm going to share one of the darkest and scariest experiences of my life with you. What you're about to hear is based on real events, and I hope you can still sleep at night, because I can't anymore. It happened 2 years ago when we traveled to Marin for my grandfather's funeral. The morning of the ceremony, just as the sun was barely rising, some of my distant relatives and I decided to visit an abandoned house 2 streets over. Maybe we thought it would be a harmless adventure, but what we experienced turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. When we arrived, the house was locked with an old, rusty padlock. But it was so decayed that a single kick broke it open. Inside, everything was dark and eerie. It felt like this house hadn't seen a living soul for decades. One part of the house was particularly dark, probably the kitchen. We decided to go there, but suddenly, a sound came from the corner of the kitchen. We all froze. Terrified, we turned towards the sound, and what we saw is something I'll never forget, a black figure, with a terrifying smile on its face, staring right at us. For a moment, it felt like our hearts stopped. Without thinking, we bolted towards the door, running so fast that if we had tripped, we would have smashed our faces into the ground. We all ran out of there. My 7-year-old brother and I barely held back our tears, and 2 of the girls from the family cried and screamed, telling their parents, but no one believed us. That night, like fools, we decided to explore another abandoned house. This time, when we arrived, we saw a wall with a smile painted on it, in what looked like blood. We entered the next room, but there was nothing. When we turned back, the wall had crumbled, and a bathtub made of clay, filled with blood, stood there. The fear this time was even worse. On our way back, we saw a woman on the roof, wearing a black chador, walking towards the edge. Behind her was a bride in white, following her slowly. Then, suddenly, they both vanished. It was as if, at that moment, the spirits were reliving the horrific fate that had befallen them. A few days later, we escaped that hell and went to my great-aunt's house. But we never managed to forget those nightmares. Remember this: first, never go to abandoned houses. Second, don't place an evil eye charm in your home. We did, and every night we all had horrifying visions, especially of that girl with hair covering her face. The Haunting of Ibrahim, A Tale from the Shadows. A month ago, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I hammed and decided to take a stroll through the village before heading to the fields. The evening air was cool, and I was lost in my thoughts when I wandered toward the river. There, my friends were gathered, and I joined them for a while. As night fell, I decided it was time to return home. While walking back, lost in my phone, a frantic shout broke the silence. I looked up to see my cousin, Ibrahim, sprinting toward me. His face was a ghastly sight, eyes bulging, skin pallid and eyes glowing a disturbing red. He was breathless and barefooted, his feet a bloody mess from running. Ibrahim tried to kill me. He gasped, his voice trembling. Before I could react, Ibrahim emerged from the thickets, his appearance now a nightmarish blend of shadows and fear. He lunged at my cousin, biting his hands ferociously. I intervened, grabbing him as he glared at me with a look that chilled me to the bone. Realizing that something was deeply wrong, I began reciting Ayat al-Kursi. As the verses echoed in the night, Ibrahim's strength waned. He tried to bite me, but I held on tight. "Let me go, I need to leave," he pleaded in a voice that was unnaturally calm and distant. I released him, and he dashed toward the village. My friends and I, filled with dread, followed him. We reached his family's land, where his parents were still harvesting wheat. Ibrahim attacked his mother with a frenzied rage. His father tried to restrain him, but Ibrahim broke free and vanished in front of our eyes. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, as if swallowed by the earth. We scoured the area, but there was no sign of him. By the time we returned, Ibrahim's mother had sought help from the local spiritual leader. We entered their yard, searched their house, but Ibrahim was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, a voice called out from the darkness, "Come here, I'm right here." I rushed to the source of the voice and found Ibrahim sitting on the wall, his eyes wide and wild. He scowled at me and then leaped off the wall. I was stunned by his speed. Despite my best efforts, I struggled to catch him. Eventually, I managed to grab him, with my friends helping to restrain him. We took him to the spiritual leader's house. Ibrahim, now under the possession of a malevolent spirit, was crying uncontrollably, his voice a horrific distortion of a child's wail. His eyes had turned completely black, and he thrashed about in terror. The spiritual leader began questioning Ibrahim, but the entity inside him refused to reveal its identity. According to lore, knowing the demon's name would grant us power over it. The leader lit a rolled-up piece of paper on fire, and the entity, frightened by the flames, began to speak. The name it revealed was ancient and complicated, a name that I can't even recall now, for fear of inviting the demon's presence. This demon claimed to be 820 years old. As I watched Ibrahim tremble in my arms, my friends holding his limbs, the spiritual leader demanded, "Will you leave his body or be imprisoned in a cursed realm?" The demon, terrified, agreed to leave. The spiritual leader instructed Ibrahim to straighten his left leg and exit his body. Ibrahim's body stiffened, then lightened, and his breathing became normal again. When Ibrahim finally calmed down, he began to scratch his chest obsessively, his skin turning red. The leader placed his hand on Ibrahim's shoulder, and the boy's body relaxed. The spiritual leader then informed us that Ibrahim could no longer see us, adding an eerie twist to the tale. When I offered Ibrahim water, he remained silent, even as his father spoke to him. Suddenly, the spiritual leader's voice thundered through the room, "Old man." Ibrahim, who had seemed to be in another realm, reacted violently, his fear palpable. The spiritual leader then asked if he was alone. The demon responded with a chilling revelation, "No, there are 27 of us." Hearing this, our fear peaked. The spiritual leader told us to leave, and he remained alone with Ibrahim. That night, Ibrahim's condition improved, but the terror didn't end there. He experienced similar episodes twice more. Thankfully, he eventually recovered, though the shadows of that night still linger.